welcome to the panel and to this discussion of the governance report. We're very lucky that the three principal authors of this report are here with us. They are, and I'll introduce them straight away to get on to the discussion as fast as possible. They are Henrik Enderlein, who's the director of the Jacques Delors Institute and a professor of political economy here at the Hertie School. He has a particularly deep interest in the euro and the eurozone, among many other things. Next to him, there is Mark Dawson, who's the professor of European law and governance at the school. He has a background in law, not surprisingly, and a PhD from the European University. And finally, the third of our co-authors is Christian Joerges, the professor of law and society at the Hertie. And he will look particularly at questions of legitimacy in the European institutions and in the European Union. And then to his left, we have, as it were, our examiner, Daniela Schwarzer, who will be commenting on what she hears this evening from the report and what she thinks about the issues raised. She is an expert in European affairs. Since last year, she's been director of the Europe programme at the German Marshall Fund of the United States here in Berlin. And most importantly of all, she was once a colleague of mine at the Financial Times, having worked at the FT and at the late lamented FT Deutschland. I am Stefan Wagstyl. I'm the FT's Berlin correspondent, and I've had the pleasure of living in this wonderful city all of 18 months. Looking at the report, I want to turn first to Henrik and ask him to focus on this phrase which has been already floated by Helmut this evening, and that is exploratory governance. What do you mean by exploratory governance? Isn't it really what in English is called muddling through?
No, it is not. Otherwise, we would not have written this report. No, I'm glad you asked that question first, because when I go to presentations like this, my first question is always, what's new there? I mean, some of the suggestions we put forward are clearly not new, but what we try to do in this report is to work more conceptually about the way this euro area crisis has been dealt with. And we came up with this question, is there something more systematic or conceptual behind muddling through that we can actually try to explain and derive from theory in political science or social sciences? And this idea of muddling through, which we define as ad hoc and stepwise policy making under uncertainty with the objective of avoiding mistakes. So again, stepwise, ad hoc policy making under uncertainty with the objective to avoid mistakes. Why do policymakers do that? They don't do that because muddling through is just the easiest way. It's a very rational way of proceeding. In political science, we have this idea of functionalist institution building, which is often described, was generally described as you create an institution in order to avoid or fix a certain problem. So something goes wrong, you create an institution to get it right. But how do you solve a problem when you know you have to do something, but you don't know what you have to create in order to fix the problem? And this is exactly what we saw in the euro area crisis, where every day there was this threat the euro would fall apart, and then what policymakers decided to adopt is something that was not the right answer in the long term, institutionally thought through and derived from the end, from the ultimate result, but was just the quick fix to avoid a mistake. And this has actually pushed us through the past 5 years. And we try to show in this report that this has certain implications, but it's certainly not just, muddling through. It's a very rational way of behavior of policymakers, whether we like it or not.
Is there not another element, which is that the EU's tradition is not to implement grand plans, partly, indeed mainly, for political reasons, that you generate so much political tension and opposition that certain things have to be done in a muddling through, or as you would say, exploratory governance way?
I think I disagree, Stefan. If you look at the euro, is there a bigger project than the euro itself? I mean, you have 11, now 19 countries abandoning their national currencies. This is as big as a project as it gets. And it was very well thought through by Jacques Delors in the 1980s. There was a plan that was devised. It was implemented in a stepwise fashion. By the way, also to respond to a problem of the single market having to deal with exchange rate fluctuations. So, no, I mean, the media often portrays the EU as something that has this, they never make grand deals. No, I mean, we have the single market, we have the euro, we have many other projects, but in this euro area crisis, it became clear that this was more about this, stepwise exploring of what was possible and was not.
Mark, if I can turn to you, doesn't this approach, exploratory governance, test the legal basis for decision-making to the limits, and quite frankly, beyond, if we look at what's been happening in the last few years?
Well, I think it definitely does. I mean, I think one thing we have to recognise is that the EU is it's changed as an organisation. I mean, when I was a law student, we were always told that the EU is based on the idea of conferral, which is the idea that the EU is only a limited organisation. It only operates in the single market and a few other areas. Now, when I have that experiment with my students and I ask, can you think of a single policy area where the EU is not an important and influential actor? I think that's a real challenge. It's a total organisation, an organisation that operates everywhere. And I think that has a real implications both for the legal structure of the EU, but also the accountability structure for the EU. So I'm thinking here about, well, how can you actually contest decisions that are made in relation to EU policy? So imagine, for example, I'm a Portuguese civil servant or a Greek civil servant and I lose my job because of a bailout program or conditionality attached to a bailout program. What can I actually do to contest that decision? And I think what we see is that that's an extremely difficult task post-crisis. So, one way in which I'd traditionally do that is I'd go to a national court or I'd go to my national parliament and try to raise political awareness there. But we see, think about the Greek election, for example, that's happened in the last months, there are limits to the possibility, actually, of mobilizing at the national level in order to change European policy. And we also see the same thing at the European level. So we know we had a European Parliament election that was about the economic governance of the EU, but the European Parliament actually doesn't have a significant say in important economic decisions, in bailout decisions, for example, or in fiscal policy. So these are some of the kind of accountability challenges we have in the EU at the moment.
If we just break a moment, we welcome our guest, and thank you very much, Mr. Letter. We have started, and we're going to go on for a few minutes, and then we will ask you very kindly to take the podium. So, Mark, you raised a very good question there about this Portuguese, let's say, civil servant. Now, if you were there and you could restructure things, how ideally would that civil servant defend his rights in the European Union?
Good question. Well, one thing is that, for example, we have, and this is something that Christian talks about in his chapter of the book, is a lack of judicial protection, for example. So consistently, the European courts, for example, have said we're not going to analyse, we're not willing to look at whether EU economic governance measures are compatible with the EU Charter of Fundamental Rights. They've said this is something outside of the scope of EU law, for example. I think that's an institutional failure. That's precisely the responsibility of the European courts to check those sorts of things. But equally at the parliamentary level, even without going in the very long term, thinking about changes to the European treaties, for example, within the context of the existing European treaties, we could imagine giving the European Parliament far greater prerogatives over things like country-specific recommendations, or recommendations made to national governments in respect of their budget. So there are kind of, relatively small-step incremental changes that we could make in the short term that could at least address some of these accountability gaps.
Christian, I mean, you've looked a lot at the legitimacy of some of these proposals. How do we make? I mean, this is a question which is repeatedly asked about the European Union, and you look at it in great depth here. How do we do this? How do we make those suggestions that Mark has just made, for example, more legitimate?
You ask a lawyer, and I would say the lost answers. The Lost Lawyer is the title of a book by Anthony Cronin from Yale, one of these wise men who observe and loves the law as I do. Now, what I'm saying is, or what I'm trying...
Please try and speak into
into this thing. What I'm doing there is to reconstruct the history of legitimacy, if you want, in the EU, and it all started with law. The European Union, or at the time community, is built on law, is going forward through law. Law is a glue which keeps everything together. Now, with the deepening and success, this was apparently not working anymore. The deep change is, in my view, the insight that with growing diversity, creating uniformity, one size fits no one kind of policy, you run with this legal integration into big troubles. At the same time, you realize how complex modern markets are and that you need a much more sophisticated institutional environment. And this grows and grows, and for a long while we all thought, well, this will grow and it will lead to a new kind of political order. Then the crisis came, and suddenly you realize, oh, we have not foreseen failures. We have not institutionalized mechanisms of repair. And this is where we are all stumbling now. And my analysis is, after the end of the integration through law project, we need a political and democratic infrastructure to reorganize Europe, and this is not in place. And this is basically a message which says we need a progressive agenda for Europe. And in order to get this, we have to be aware that it cannot be a way backwards. It has to be a new kind of design. My formula for that is more horizontal constitutionalism. Nobody understands that. Other people talk of democracy, a couple of democracies working together, and so on. But the basic message is that the thing is too complex to be governed by command and control from above. It will not work. And at the same time, it is too interdependent to leave everybody alone. So the tension we have to face is that we have to build something like a legitimacy which is based on the fairness and solidarity of interactions in the Union. And that's a big project. I stop here because it's getting very complicated.
And who is this? Whose job is it to get this going? Is this a job for Angela Merkel? Or is it? No.
No, we have a situation where we have three disciplines basically involved, and we realize they all have something important to say, but there is no big brain which is synthesizing all that. And what is not possible in theory is also not possible in practice. So what we have to hope for is indeed what has been articulated by the Dean. Contestation is not necessarily a bad thing. Contestation may be also productive. So my vision of that is we should not say we know the solution, but we know what kind of new polity organization we will need, and this can be accompanied and this can be stimulated by all sorts of means. The law may regain some importance in that, because the law may simply be there to discipline the kind of conflict resolution in the Union. And this one example of human rights is one where the law can have a disciplining and good role to defend social entitlements, other accomplishments of the nation states which are worth preserving, and so on.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
But just to go my question, put my question another way, if not now, when? We have the pressure of events, we have the pressure of the populists. Who is actually going to pick up the cudgels here and fight for the sort of change that you're describing, and how?
Our students. No, it will not be from one day to the other. Right. This will be a long process, and it will be painful, and it will be difficult, because it is, just as the Euro was an incomplete project, so to speak, and now the completion of this project is something which has no blueprint. It has to be discovered in the process of debating and contestation, and there are some ideas out there, what can be done and what can be... Only the recipe for how do we get there and when, this is not around.
I'm going to bring you in a moment, Daniela, but I think Henrik would like to make a point.
Just one point. I think it's really a situation where you need strong political leadership at the top. I like to compare this with the late 1980s. I referred to this before. Europe was going through this phase of the single market, hampered by the exchange rate movements. So the idea was, how do we get this fixed? We create a single currency. And this was exactly a grand plan put up by the Commission President then to go through three phases, a treaty change. There was a lot of contestation. We all remember the discussions over the Maastricht Treaty in various countries. This was a moment which actually solved exploratory governance in the sense that there was a vision and there was a way towards this. And I think we need this moment now, and this is what we argue in the report, to have, I hope the new Commission President is going to play this role, to pick up that task and say, and now we don't look at next year, but we look at where we want this monetary union to be in 10 or 15 years, and take the time to develop a 3-phase, 4-phase approach to get us where we want to be.
Right. So not Angela Merkel, but Jean-Claude Juncker. Let's leave that one. Daniela, you've heard the preliminary and introductory remarks. You've also had a chance to look at the report, and you look at the issues broadly. What do you think of what you've heard so far?
Thank you, Stefan.
How many out of 10?
First of all, let me say, of course, as you all know, this is not the only report on Eurozone governance. And yet it is an interesting one. Why is this so? I think Henrik's first point partly answered that question. It combines two things. First of all, it is about explaining what has happened in a new framework. I mean, there are many accounts of institutional change over the last 5 years or so. This new view of exploratory governance is interesting, and I'll have a comment on substance in a second. And then it combines this view of, basically what is possible with perspectives on what should be done in a functionalist way, arguing from an economic perspective, this is what we need to govern the Eurozone in a reasonable way. And then the legal perspective comes in as to what is possible in legal terms. So this encompassing view is interesting. Many of the reports that are out there, many of the policy papers take one or the other perspective. This is pretty broad, and hence it's a useful contribution. My other point as an introduction would be that, of course, the issue is still highly salient. I mean, we've been discussing this, and a lot of progress has been made, not only since the sovereign debt crisis broke in 2010, but actually as early as 2008. The first ideas were out, 8, 9, on how we should reform the supervisory structures in financial markets. And then came the sovereign debt crisis. So suddenly, economic governance, fiscal surveillance, and of course crisis management came onto the agenda. And what this report does, it shows very clearly how crisis management measures actually have lasting, not only institutional consequences, because new actors have actually been created, which can be further developed. For instance, the ESM can be developed into European Monetary Fund, but also that this changes the political economy of the Eurozone. Actors now look at, first of all, financial market actors look at the Eurozone in a different way, since they know there is something like the ESM which can work on recapitalizing banks and can lend to governments. The European Central Bank has moved into a different role. I mean, not legally, but of course de facto, it's a different actor. So this has changed the political economy of the Eurozone. So we need to assess where we already are to think ahead on what is possible. Now I'd like to make 3 points on substance, on issues that have been mentioned. First of all, the idea of exploratory governance. I follow Henrik in his analysis saying actors have looked at solutions with a concern not to make mistakes. I would add a question here, and that question is, how do actors evaluate right and wrong policy choices? Because if you think you want to avoid a mistake, you of course have a certain framework evaluating what you want to do. And that is a framework, it's economic thinking, it's economic theory, but it's of course also national constraints you're facing, and these are political and these are legal. So I would say, yes, it's an interesting concept, but we should not be over-rationalizing in the sense of actors try to avoid mistakes for the Eurozone. I would say the opposite was the case. I mean, there was always the notion we need to save the euro, but each national decision maker, and Angela Merkel, whom you have mentioned, has obviously played a very prominent role in all the decision making since 2010, follows a double logic of, yes, maintaining the Eurozone, but also doing what is perceived as right in terms of that specific national context and the thinking about how the Eurozone actually works. And I think if the crisis has surfaced one thing, It is that between Paris and Berlin and Brussels and whichever other capital you wish to pick, there is not Rome, we'll hear that in a second, or Riga. There will be different answers on what right is. And what we have discovered in a very painful way is that the Maastricht Treaty hasn't settled those different notions in a sort of consensual way, but it's all open again, so how does this monetary union actually work? That brings me to my second point, and that's basically the question of contestation, which Helmut initially mentioned, and it's in the report as a very present concept. Yes, contestation is there, so we can't define it away. But the question here is, how useful is it? And how can we channel those different notions of how the monetary union actually works in a way that we do not face a situation where the contestation that, in my view, at this point predominantly happens on the national level in national logics of European realities becomes obstructive both to governing at this moment and also reforming governance towards the future. And I think the populist threat which we are facing at the moment is precisely an expression of this risk that contestation is very powerful and impacts the agendas of domestic, national, mainstream parties already, but it renationalizes discourse. And it brings us further away from actually acknowledging what the introduction of the single currency has produced. And that's my third and last point, where the report is strong on the substantive suggestions on where the monetary union should move. The report is basically about that we need to realize we have a single currency, but we also have a European economy which yet doesn't function properly. And this is true on the market level, hence the introductory slides on the single market is really on the top of the agenda because a monetary union needs functioning markets, financial markets, labor markets, etc. So there's a market issue to create a better functioning cross-border economy, but there's also a governance issue. And here we are going right into the solidarity questions. What kind of instruments do we need? And I have to stop here for reasons of time, but just sort of one of the little bullet points here, which was linked to the slide where the single market was put up as an issue, was we need a convergence of economic business cycles. Absolutely true, but this is a huge policy proposal. So, there is a lot of substance in this report in the sense of we really have to acknowledge an institutional and financial, in terms of institutions and financial tools, where we are. And if we want to make this a functioning economy, this has fiscal implications on the federal level, whichever way you want to design them. And then, of course, you face totally new questions of democratic legitimacy. Some of them have been highlighted on this panel. There's a question of involving parliaments in a better way. But this discussion will go very far once you actually acknowledge what kinds of tools you need, new tools which we don't have yet on the Eurozone level. The question of democratic legitimacy reaches even more salience than it already has today. Thanks.
Thank you. Henrik, you made many points, Daniela, and we can't possibly comment around all of them, but let me just pick up the economic points you made towards the end and put this point to you, Henrik. The report also highlights how convergence has become more difficult through the financial crisis. So precisely the kind of bringing together of economic cycles that might be desirable becomes even harder. How do we get there from where we are now?
Well, I think this goes very far in terms of the economic technicalities, but let me just make 2 points. One is the euro was supposed, at least in theory, to bring the euro area economies closer. But what we've seen is actually, at least in the crisis, more divergence. They've moved apart. And the ECB, as the only actor who works for the entire euro area, targets always the middle. So focuses on or does the right monetary policy for a country that does not exist. One size fits none. And so the ECB's policy, and it's not the ECB's fault, is too restrictive for one part of the euro area and too lax for the other part of the euro area. And we are even today in that situation where in Germany we see a finally this pickup in inflation, housing prices, etc., and it will only be a matter of time until people will look at the ECB and say, well, now please stop QE and raise interest rates, whereas for the other part of the euro area, it's still too restrictive. So what do we need? We actually need structural reforms in order to make those business cycles more convergent. But Daniela is entirely right. This is easily said, but it's a huge policy exercise. Or we need some kind of rebalancing mechanism, which is some kind of a European unemployment insurance or cyclical adjustment mechanism. But again, that's politically so difficult even to mention that we see how much is ahead of us. And I think this is where we go back to exploratory governance. People sit here today and look at this huge task which they have in front of them, policymakers, and say, this is too big. Let's make that next step first. But if we do this in that way, we will lose legitimacy, and I have serious doubts this euro area in its present format can survive.
Would you agree, Christian, on that legitimacy point in particular?
Bring in another point, which is also a point of hope. Because I do not believe that convergence or the non-occurrence of convergence is necessarily a bad thing. It's first of all unavoidable. If we look into the whole literature on varieties of capitalism and so on, and the resistance of these structures against harmonization from above, I'm thinking of Italy. North and South is different, even after such a long time. And this is not to say the South has now to move. Okay, but this is something which is occurring in a country which has its own history, which has its own flourishing region. I have been recently to Le Marche, once a flourishing region now. Okay, I'm saying we have in Europe a huge variety of successful modes of organizing capitalism. And to say we harmonize this is not exactly the message I think Henrik has. The problem is it conceivable, and some economic historians say that not only do these things survive, but this coexistence and competition among them is a productive chance. So the Germans build their cars, okay, but other regions in the Union do other things and do them better and so on. So you cannot export, for instance, the German model of trade union bargaining and cooperation with the politicians. This is one thing, and it is there. It is not worth destroying it, but it is not possible to export it step by step. So it has to be, I think, a process also where we learn to profit from our individual experiences and successes. I've been long in Tuscany. Tuscany, not so long ago, was a wonderful example for a region with a very specific economic structure. Pure Sable were praising it, other people. Now, it is in difficulty, but one has to consider how these kind of diversities can be made sustainable. I think it's a productive chance, but this is, of course, something which I base upon a couple of literature which may not be representative, but it is not silly. It is a solid branch of political economy, and economic historians also defend this idea.
And Mark, how do we do this? I mean, how do we build the legal basis for this decision making that is needed in order to move in this direction?
Well, I think one thing that's important, and I think this goes back to something that Daniela mentioned about sort of the way in which, for example, contestation is managed in the EU. It's true that, for example, we have a move towards a kind of renationalisation of European politics. I think we very much saw that in this debate over whether, for example, we should have war reparations going from Greece to Germany and so on. But we also have to remember that the danger is we have an institutional structure that encourages a renationalisation of politics, because we have an institutional structure where national executives are very predominant, where we have a European Council dominated by heads of government who make most decisions, who make the most important decisions. And when they're making those decisions, of course, naturally, they're keeping national interests in mind. So I think if we're going to have productive contestation, if we're going to have a move towards a more functionally ambitious integration project that can be legally and constitutionally legitimate. We have to find more productive ways of channeling that contestation, which is why we want to think in the report about perhaps European parliamentarization as being a more useful route than going down this route of purely executive politics, purely the European Council being the predominant actor.